Hello, and welcome to Emotional Badass, where Moxie meets Mindful. I'm Nikki Eisenhower, life coach and psychotherapist, and your host. And on today's episode, I am interviewing Tony Overbay, licensed marriage and family therapist, and host of his own podcast, The Virtual Couch. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Hey, Nikki, I couldn't wait to jump in. I was just chomping at the bit. It's great to be on your show.
It's great to have you on the show. We've been wanting to do this for a long time. You were the very first person to reach out to me and to invite me onto your show after I launched Emotional Badass.
Okay, I didn't even realize that. And your episode on the Virtual Couch continues to be one that is, thousands of downloads more than most of the other episodes, because that whole concept of HSP, highly sensitive person, has been, it's changed. It's helped me in my practice. And I feel like it's just helped so many people that I work with and that reach out to me through therapy. So it has been a game changer for me, and I'm grateful for that.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that for you and for clients, and that something about me is effective in helping people understand themselves. Yeah. That's good to hear. Well, and I know that today we could talk about so many things, because this is what happened when we connected on your show. You and I could probably talk for days without taking a breath. And I can hear that you're getting over a cold and have a little scruffiness to your voice. So we'll try to keep that in mind as we go through this interview today. But I really want to talk to you about how you handle porn addiction.
Yeah. And by the way, I think I had a joke queued up there where I feel like I sound like 80s Demi Moore. I mean, it sounds kind of, that scratchy, but it's, my voice is on the rebound. Actually, it was gone, which is a horrible thing, as you know, for a therapist. I don't know if your voice has ever left you when you talk for a living, but it's brutal, It is brutal. And it's that awful feeling going through your day of, oh no, hang with me voice to get that last client in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, but your question is a great one. I mean, and I if you don't mind, I'll give just maybe 30 seconds, a minute of background. And, I had a career in software. I was in high tech for about a decade, and I had that, we all kind of hear this cliche, but it was really true, where I felt a calling to kind of go back and help men. And I was a new dad. I loved my marriage. I just felt like when I would see people complain about their marriages or fatherhood, I just wanted to go help men. And so I went back to school. I got my master's in counseling. And what nobody told me through that process was that guys actually don't typically go to counseling. So all of a sudden I show up, in therapy, and I'm not seeing the population that I thought I would see. But when I did start to see men, it was primarily when they were coming to me with addictions. And one of the main things that I started working with was pornography addiction. And so I learned all of the behavioral tools. I learned all of the things that people could do. But the more that I saw, clients, dozens and dozens of clients that were struggling with pornography addiction or just compulsive sexual behavior in general, I started to recognize that it was more of a coping mechanism. And I found that these people weren't, I like to say that they had a void somewhere, whether it was a void in their relationships, or a void in their parenting, or a void in their career, or a void in their health, or their spirituality, or there was somewhere that they didn't feel connected, or lots of places they didn't feel connected. And the pornography, or whatever the addiction was, kind of jumped in there to fill that space, or to be that, instant gratification. So, that kind of changed the whole way that I worked with people that were struggling with addiction.
It's such an important thing. I feel like I've been very blessed to naturally have had many male clients over the years, which I know is not very typical as I've grown. And one of the things that really helped me in my own personal healing was seeing men really seek out being a better person, understanding themselves more, wanting to be a better father, wanting to be a better partner and spouse, wanting to be a better person in the world. And I think historically men have been told so often in so many ways, directly and indirectly, stuff your feelings, toughen up, suck it up, and just live life and plow through.
Yes. And you nailed it. And I feel like, one of the things is back in the, if I go olden days, there was a question of, if someone was exposed to pornography, whether it was magazines or a stag film, I think they used to call them. And we're in the day and age now where it's definitely not a if, it's when that exposure occurs. And with the prevalence of, easy access to pornography now, that age of first, exposure is now between 8 and 11 years old. So we're kind of dealing with this problem where people have had that in their lives. They have turned to that for, immediate or instant gratification. So you've already kind of started with that in mind. So you're right. So now when a guy is trying to be a better fill in the blank, and then he doesn't feel like he's doing it well enough, or if he feels like that's too vulnerable, it's really easy for the brain to just say, hey, I know a quick way to fix this. It'll give us a big dopamine rush. And, but it's not dealing with the main issue or problem, or, wherever that source of discontent is. So you're absolutely right.
Before we get too much into this topic, I want to name this for listeners too, because one of the things I really enjoyed about being on your show is how you and I are very, very different people. And I think we have such an opportunity to sort of host for each other and the world, how important it is that people who are very different keep conversations going and keep sort of expanding what we know and how we learn and how we grow. I think part of what's happening in the world right now is there's so much reactivity and anger and hurt that people really aren't listening to each other, and they're creating these echo chambers of feedback that is very, very limited instead of expansive. You come from, a very Christian background. I grew up very Catholic, and then I spent a lot of time in the Lutheran Church. I help a lot of people in my practice who have left organized religion and who have felt very, very hurt and shamed. And I've often struggled to understand what an organized religion, why so many organized religions seem to shame us around sex and sexuality and sex feeling good, sex being something that we're interested in, touching our bodies, and masturbation. So I just want to name all of this as we start to dive in. Right. Yeah. So I appreciate that too. I feel like it's interesting. One of the things that I feel like my soapbox of all soapboxes is taking shame out of this entire equation, because I do feel like, and I've done a lot of media, especially the last couple of weeks. I've got a book that just came out about pornography addiction and compulsive sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. And, I often say, when people say, hey, but isn't a little bit of porn good, or that sort of thing. And I always say, my job is not to judge. My job is to help what somebody brings to the table, what they want help with. And I feel like where I go with that is, I do feel like that, we're missing an opportunity for connection, if that's maybe the place that people do turn for the coping, or for maybe this instant gratification, but that doesn't mean that I'm trying to bring shame to what someone's behavior is. My goal is that if that's something that they want to do less of, or if it's something that they don't want in their relationship, then, there are ways to make that happen. So I appreciate you saying that too, because that shame piece, that's the part that really does keep any kind of addictive behavior or compulsive behavior in the shadows, or not out in the open to be dealt with or talked about or even rallied around. Well, and you're starting to answer a question. So I have a client, as I have had many over the years, who just left Mormonism, and I asked if she had any questions, and her question is, in my experience growing up in the church, I noticed people being told that they had porn addictions, when in reality, they used it to masturbate on occasion. But oftentimes, any use of porn and masturbating is considered wrong and framed as a soul-crushing addiction. What's been your experience with this, and what can people do to combat that? And I think everything about this episode is going to answer this question.
No, that's a great question. And because, it's funny, I've done, again, I hate to keep going back to I've done a lot of interviews, Nikki, but I get asked that all the time about, what is porn addiction? Is porn addiction even a thing? And I'm very open. I mean, it's not in the DSM, right? It's not actually a diagnosis. And if anything, you can look at impulse control disorder. But so I don't, some people want to call it porn addiction. Some people want to call it a pornography problem. Some people want to just call it a behavior that they want to get rid of. And so, but I do feel like a lot of people immediately throw that word or that phrase of porn addiction onto somebody who it's not that they have a daily problem with it, or even a weekly, or it's, so it is kind of used in a general term, especially, not just in the Mormon church, but I find in Christianity in general, where there's a lot of, I just like to call it good old Christian guilt that comes with that, where, that, again, that's what kind of keeps this whole thing in the shadows, or what kind of keeps people feeling like they can't open up to, if it's their pastor or their bishop or their religious leader about it. And so I actually did a podcast episode with a podcast that does a lot of training in the LDS church, in the LDS faith. And in that one, my whole episode is removing shame, from the bishop's office, because I feel like if somebody comes to clergy and they want to work on this, or they want to lessen, the frequency, or if they want to put this behind them, they need to be welcomed into this office. They need to be thanked for coming into the office. They need to be told that there is love in that office. And in no place have I ever seen shame be the key to overcoming any kind of addictive behavior.
Beautiful. I mean, this is why I wanted to have you on the show, because we need more, I think, voices like mine who are coming from a non-religious place, and we need voices like yours who are coming from those practices, because we need to eliminate shame when it comes to our natural human curiosity, sex and sexuality, our development, the stumbling and the awkwardness that all of us have as human beings, figuring out sex and what it is and how to feel good about it and how to let go of our own hang-ups. Right. We all need that. We all go through that.
And the problem that I often see in kind of framed in a religious context is it is kind of framed as it's bad, don't think about it, don't, all of these things. But then as soon as you're married, then it's like, it's wonderful, now go for it, and not realizing the baggage, that people then carry into their marriages or their partnerships or their relationships, where then when they're told, okay, now it's okay, you can be sexual, people don't recognize that if you've spent a decade plus of feeling shame around even thinking about it, or even talking about it, or if in the home it isn't talked about. And I'm surprised how many people that never had the talk growing up with a parent, because I think that the parents just feel like it's something that's awkward, and so they don't want to talk about it. And so the more, when we have to start talking about this with kids, we have to be open about it. We have to use the correct terms. We have to, again, not have any shame around that with our kids, in order to be able to just start to promote a healthy sexuality. A lot of times when I have somebody come into my office and they are wanting to, put their pornography challenges or struggles or issues behind them, one of the first things I do after thanking them and just being so grateful that they're willing to come and open up and talk to me about it is, if we want to go full Christianity, and I sometimes say that, hey, what is it? Procreate, replenish the earth. I mean, that stuff's in the Bible. It's, it's like if God made you, it's like He made you to feel pleasure and joy, and that. So it's all normal. It's normal to have the feelings. Oftentimes I say, if you didn't have those feelings, that's a whole other thing that we need to talk about. But so then it's like, how do you use those feelings in a healthy expression or a healthy connection? So no, I'm so grateful that you're talking about this, Nikki, because I always say I have yet to find, and I've worked with now, I think 11 or 1,200 people that have tried to, that want to get past pornography or compulsive sexual behavior. And I have yet to find one situation where shame was involved in any bit of the recovery. Almost in all of them, I've had to, slowly but surely work with people to remove the shame, but I've never seen it be, a component of recovery.
No, I don't think shame can be a component of any kind of recovery. It's absolutely what blocks our recovery. And you're so right about how our psychology works. I think that's been my beef with a lot of organized religion over the course of my life, that they seem to want that sexual relationship with ourselves to be like a light switch. And we've known for a long time that our psychology doesn't work that way. You can't just get married and then, yay, now I get to be a sexual being. There's no light switch like that. So we absolutely bring all that baggage forward. And it's heartbreaking to me to work with somebody that's in their 60s who has carried that kind of baggage and shame around sex and pleasure and feeling good over the course of a lifetime simply because they grew up with certain doctrine.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Because I feel like that's part of where you're missing out on life. I mean, you're missing out on the, if we want, again, pull in the total spiritual card, but you're missing out on God's creations, including the human body and the people's sexuality. And so, I was on a podcast recently where the person was, he's a non-Christian, he's not Christian, but he wanted me to come on and he said, what's the deal with all the shame? And it was funny because I think that he assumed that I was going to defend shame and say, well, here's why shame is good. And it's like, oh, heck no. I mean, there's none of it, there's absolutely none of it. And I feel like that's the part where people kind of attach to these, sackcloth and ashes or broken heart and contrite spirit kind of, these type of quotes or scriptures that are in the Bible. And they feel like, well, I have to beat myself up about it. I have to feel bad about that. And again, that's the part where I'm like, okay, no, there's nothing productive about that part. It's just not, that's not any part that feels like love. I mean, and ultimately that's what's going to move us forward.
Well, and it's baffling to me how, like, we're about to hit 2020, like we are in modern times, but it's baffling to me how much religion has been able to hold on to shaming almost all forms of pleasure, and just why that has been continued baffles me.
Yeah. And thank goodness there is a nice movement of, there's a lot of people, myself, and there's some other people that I've had on my own podcast. And Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife is one, for example, who's really working with women and for women's healthy sexuality. And for me, I feel like a lot of times, I don't want to, I love working with individuals. I can't even tell you how much I do and the trust that they put in me, but it breaks my heart at times where I get a new client in and it's almost like I hear them, even if they've, whatever the word they like to choose, if it's a relapse or acting out or whatever they want to say, whatever they like to call it. And then I see them kind of, droop their shoulders down and they get sad. And it's almost like they want to show me, no, see, Tony, I feel bad. And at this point I'm like, no, I don't want you to feel bad. That's not going to get us anywhere. That's what's kind of gotten you into my office. And that's what's caused you to continue to feel like you're less than or not good enough or that something's wrong with you. And that's the part that we have to try to eliminate. That's the key to having somebody just feel more connected with, again, fill in the blank, partner, kids, career, spirituality, health, you name it.
Mm-hmm. It really is bonkers that so many of us have picked up the learning that we're supposed to self-motivate by feeling awful.
Yeah. And sometimes I do think that it's almost, is it the fear of, what if I do succeed? Is it the fear of, let's say I put this behind me and then will I never feel this, euphoric rush or that sort of thing? I do wonder at times, is it the brain trying to say, hold on now, whatever we got to do to kind of keep things the status quo or the path of least resistance? Because, sometimes it's scary to think about what life will feel like. What if I don't know how to connect with my partner? Or what if I don't know how to really go after the job I want? Or, as long as I can kind of stay in the shame bubble or guilt, and then which continues to feed maybe a compulsive behavior. I don't know. I don't know if you see where I'm going there, but sometimes I wonder if it's even a little bit of self-sabotage too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then I think it loops and kind of keeps us stuck.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let me ask you to kind of give the overview of what is your program?
You bet. So, again, kind of with that, first of all, the kind of the hope, I'm a big strength-based person, and we're going to try to remove that guilt, that shame. I think a big part of this is really looking at what are the stories that my brain is kind of fusing to or attaching to. And I think one of the things that's has been a tiny bit controversial in the past, I don't feel like it's necessarily the same anymore, is that when someone is trying to, lessen a compulsive behavior or an addictive behavior or a negative behavior, is that we often have this all or nothing mentality. And so, if somebody says, okay, I'm never going to do this again, and then they do because they've got these nice deep neural pathways of the brain, or there's these triggers, that pop up in their life, and the brain kind of goes into almost autopilot, and then they kind of act out on whatever the compulsive behavior is. And I feel like in those moments, that's when people then, they kind of they throw up their hands. It's almost like they say, see, I mean, I told you I'm broken, or I told you that I can't do this, or I've tried this so many times. And I feel like a big part of my program is identifying, those negative kind of stories that our brain is telling us, that cognitive fusion that we have. Because if we believe those stories, the brain tells us, then we don't have to kind of defuse or kind of meditate or mindfully, detach from those stories and then go back toward the path of whatever that new goal is that we have. And I feel like in that process, a lot of times there's this concept of harm reduction. So if someone was, let's say that they really wanted to put pornography behind them and they were viewing it daily. Well, guess what? If then the next week they view it 6 times and not 7, hey, that's a win. That's the harm,
Success.
that's the harm reduction model. Or if they were, okay, let's be like super real. I work with people that compulsive sexual behavior, that they go out and have unprotected sex, that they have illicit sex, that they, and so if they go from that to pornography, guess what? That's harm reduction, right? Or if somebody's looking at very, graphic, hardcore pornography, and they kind of dial it back to images or that sort of thing, that's harm reduction, that's success. And so I feel like you have to help somebody just find some success or find some victories, or I always kind of say just get some footing that they can kind of push off from. And so with my program, I mean, a lot of what I do is some, good old cognitive behavioral therapy mixed with some acceptance and commitment therapy of identifying those negative stories that we tell ourselves. And there's a lot of that mindfulness component of being able to kind of really change the relationship with our thoughts and recognize that, hey, the thought I'm having in this moment, it occurred, you bet it did. And because I'm human, or I have this trigger. I mean, one of the examples is, people like to think that the trigger is, some beautiful woman walks by, but it's really the triggers I find are the most, or I call them crimes of opportunity. If somebody's home alone and there's the computer, I mean, that's trigger. Then the brain goes from, there's trigger, and then there's a thought, and then there's an action. And so the trigger's there. They have the thought that, okay, I can totally view porn, and then they take action. And so a lot of times I'm just having them, put a little distance, a little space between that thought and the action. And that's where that diffusion comes from, or that mindfulness comes from. And sometimes they do it perfectly, and sometimes they may not. And if they don't, then I always say that, hey, there's this data to work with. There's the game film. Let's look at that. Let's take the shame out of it. And where are some areas that we can kind of, what was our brain fusing to, or where could we maybe shore up that trigger a little bit? Because I just want people to have success, because I feel like that's where any type of addiction, this lives in this, shame and failure and the what's wrong with me story that they play in their brain. And that's where I say, hey, what if nothing's wrong with you? What if this is just kind of where we're at in life right now, and now we're going to move forward? So I don't know if that kind of gives a decent enough overview.
It does. And it tells me something that's very important to me, is that a healthy healer meets people exactly where they are. And that's what you just named. And I think I'm an addiction specialist. And one of the things that I don't think mental health has done a good job of for the public is in really defining the nuance of addiction. So I think so many people, we talk about this 100% abstinence, which out of the gate sounds like a very high mountain for anybody to climb. 100% of everything. Because so much of what I do with people is working on perfectionism. But the second we throw the word addiction in there, we want someone to do it perfectly. And I don't think we really talk about the nuance of that. And then on top of it, if I'm talking to somebody about heroin or alcohol, you don't need one bit of heroin or alcohol to live. There's alcohol or heroin, you don't need one bit of that to live a fulfilled, healthy life. Sex and food are a different category. And I think we lump a lot of things in to this sort of 100% mentality in a way that really sets us up for self-sabotage and failure. Because sex and food, yes, they can be very addictive, but we've got to look at that in a real harm reduction, with a real harm reduction lens, because we need those things.
Absolutely. And I love the way you say that, because that is back to that, meet a client where they're at. And I know you love acceptance and commitment therapy too. I mean, I love doing when somebody says, man, why am I thinking these things? Well, you're thinking those things because you're a human being you're the only one on the earth who has had all of the situations, the nature, the nurture, the DNA, the birth order, the abandonment, the rejection, the the hopes, the dreams, the people that have left, that have died. You're the only person that has that experience. So you're thinking the things you're thinking because you're you. If you didn't think those things, I always throw in there, this is my own take, but then you're a robot or a psychopath, right? So, you know, so it's like, it's good that you're having those thoughts. And so I love that you're saying that. So you meet the person where they're at. And so anybody that just jumps in and immediately says, well, here's what you need to do. It's like, okay, we're already going into, you know, defense mode, right? Because it's like the person, nobody really does know what we're feeling or what we're going through. So we need to start with somebody right there by our side that says, all right, hey, let's figure this out. You know, I gotcha. And I just, you know.
Well, I find too, like you mentioned, sort of the obvious trigger of someone thinking that, oh, you know, what made me relapse in terms of porn is, oh, I saw a beautiful woman. I think for all addictive things, and I can argue that all of us are addicted to phones and computers, you know, so I think it's very human to fall into addictive pattern. And I think we don't name that enough, that it's just maybe part of the human experience. And when we're out of balance, we are out of balance. And the more we stay out of balance, the more out of balance and out of whack we get. And we need to know that as a society. But I find that most people look for the obvious trigger, like you named, you know, the beautiful woman. People tend to be really shocked that the number one trigger is really the absence. It's boredom.
Yeah, exactly. That's why, yes, crimes of opportunity, boredom. It's like, well, what else am I going to do? I mean, yes. And you're absolutely correct. And I love what you're talking about with the, you know, so on the beginning of my podcast, and then if you read in my about, I say I'm an ultra marathon runner. I've done 150 or more of marathons or longer distances, including races of over 100 miles at a time. And I love that when I get to go speak to schools or whatever, and you know, and I'm asked, oh, well, why do you do that? And I'll make a lighthearted joke about, so I can eat more ice cream, you know, or whatever. But in reality, it's like, I believe that's most likely my socially acceptable, healthy addiction. I mean, I think that we all kind of have these things we turn to. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I have been trying so hard now to just gently bring awareness to when I'm wanting to check my phone for no reason whatsoever. And because anything kind of left, I almost feel like unchecked, we can start to develop a bit of a compulsion around, or maybe a bit of an addiction. So I love that you said that.
Absolutely.
So it really is just kind of, you know, recognizing that and not beating yourself up about that either.
Well, and maybe in the next 20 years, you know, our field will have a much different conversation about human beings and addiction. Well, at large.
I think so. Yeah, I definitely think so. Yeah.
So let's do this a little bit. So are you pro masturbation?
So that is such a good question. I
love that I'm asking a guy this question.
I know. I'm like, is Nikki going to ask me? So here's where I've got my private experiences. If I go back to that acceptance and commitment therapy model, right? So this is the thing where if I'm working, I meet the client wherever they're at. If the client is feeling shame around masturbation, then I'm going to work with them on what are those stories that their brain's telling them. If they use pornography with masturbation, you know, then is that, I do want to kind of bring some awareness to, is that possibly warping one's sexuality, or is that keeping them away from being as connected to a partner? You know, with me personally, you know, I've been married for 29 years to my high school sweetheart, who I adore. I mean, I adore her more than anything in the world. So for me personally, it's something that I haven't necessarily turned to, used, you know, because I feel like I want to have any of that kind of an experience with my wife, which she will just be mortified when she hears this episode. So it's like, I mean, I think that's I think I dodged that like a good politician. You know, am I pro? Am I con? It's like, I want to kind of meet the client wherever they're at, I guess, if that makes sense.
Well, what I'm hearing, and if I was talking to a client, the way I would volleyball that back is I'm hearing that it's very important to you to be connected to your partner, and that's something that is really like a giving thing between you and your partner. And so you want to keep that space for her.
I really do. And so you're better at that than I am. I'm gonna get transcripts of this one, have this one ready for the next time. But I mean, because I don't want to shame anyone, but my private or personal experience is exactly that. I mean, I feel like if someone feels like that's the way that they need to cope, or even just they want that dopamine hit or to feel good, or then, you know, I want to work with them on what they're bringing to the table. Do they feel like they do that too much? Do they feel like that does leave them not in a position to be as present with their partner, then I can help them with that. But for me personally, I love what you just said. Man, actually, Nikki, you just tapped into something big here. So when I'm kind of working with people to change their relationship with their sexuality, I'm not saying that from a standpoint of that I'm saying you shouldn't want to have sex with your partner or, none of that. But I also have a podcast where I talk a lot about these levels of intimacy. And there's some amazing research that goes around when you're in this relationship that, we often meet our partner and we find them physically attractive. That's human nature. That's normal. And so we find them attractive, and that's our connection. Then underneath this, there's almost like this ladder. At the bottom of that ladder is psychological intimacy. It's honesty, it's loyalty, it's trust, it's commitment. But above that is verbal intimacy. And so we want to be able to just talk with our partner for days, and above that is emotional intimacy. So then we feel like if we can just talk to them for days, the next step is we can really open up to them and share our most intimate feelings. So if I jump back up to that, if we start at physical, then let's say we go down and we're trying to talk to our partner and it doesn't work. Like we argue or we don't have the communication skills or, to really be able to communicate, but we jump back up to physical because I always jokingly say, because she's hot, or I can have sex with her, and then all of a sudden we jump back down on this ladder and we try to open ourselves up emotionally, and the person isn't there for us. They kind of leave us hanging, or they maybe gaslight us, but then it's like all of a sudden, but we can connect physically. And so when we're not really working on that relationship, I feel like too often we turn right back up to, at least we can connect sexually. And so that often becomes unfortunately, I believe that becomes the foundation. And when that becomes the foundation, I feel like that's the part where there may never quite be the connection that we want, but we continue to turn back to sexual intimacy. So when I think of my own relationship, then I love nothing more than to be able to just talk to my wife about anything. And I feel that's that verbal intimacy. Above that's that emotional intimacy where I feel like we can open up and share emotional bids and be there because we've done a lot of work around that. The next one up is cognitive and intellectual intimacy. So we don't even, one could be a PhD and one can have a GED, but if we got the verbal and the emotional connection, then we can still connect cognitive and intellectually. Above that is spiritual intimacy. So, if we're connected verbally, emotionally, cognitive, intellectually, we can be in two completely different places spiritually, but we want to talk and share that. And then the physical intimacy becomes the byproduct of those. So that is the longest answer in the entire world that you set me up for beautifully, Nikki, of that I feel like, yes, in my relationship, I want nothing more than to have the verbal and the emotional, all those levels of intimacy, and then save that, save that part of the connection for physical intimacy. So I don't feel like that for me personally is something I necessarily want to kind of turn to on my own. But again, you see where I'm going with that?
Oh yeah. I'm super grateful for your answer. I'm grateful that you've answered it.
You should have seen me. I was standing up and pacing around my office.
I didn't mean to make you sweaty. Get you anxious.
No, it's good. It was really good. I love it.
I love that you're naming all these different forms of intimacy because all of this work is very, very nuanced. And it's not as simple as saying something is good or something is bad. Now, lots of times I am pro-masturbation because I am working with sexual abuse survivors. And I think that's a very intimate way to start to get to know your own body, to start to have some control over touch and where that's happening. So when you look at these things, there are ways, like just like you were naming, Tony, that there are ways to be sexual and actually be hiding from intimacy. There are ways to use masturbation and sex in ways that are infinitely healthy and increase connection. And there are ways to do the very same act that can help us hide from connection and intimacy. And we've got to know that that's possible. It's not just about doing something or not doing it. It really is about what energy am I bringing to this? And is this about connecting me or is this about me hiding?
Well, okay. All that stuff I just said is you just summed it up in those two sentences. Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, that's wonderful.
So let me move on to this idea a little bit, because I think part of why we're seeing so much porn addiction now is sort of this, how can I say it? Modern porn versus vintage porn. I think you used to have to work for it more if you had to go find a magazine and flip through a magazine, and then you had to use your imagination to really bring that magazine to life. Like you were still sort of working for it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Keep going, and then I'll jump in. That's such a yes.
I think now, like part of what frightens me, like when I'm working with mothers of young boys in particular, part of what frightens me is that they're never going to even have that experience of needing to find it or to snoop or to sort of go through the work to kind of get there, as goofy as that sounds, because all they need to do is turn on the computer and get flooded, and not just with the images of one to a handful of images, but thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands. So for me, there's a big issue with how flooded our youth is with this information.
Absolutely. Okay, so are you familiar? Are you familiar with the Coolidge effect? Have you heard of that?
The Coolidge effect. Remind me.
Yeah. Okay. This one is fascinating. It's exactly what you're talking about. So, when I grew up, and I loved it. One of my friends they had found or gotten a hold of a Playboy somehow, and they put a Boy's Life, the Scout magazine. They put the Boy's Life cover around this one magazine, and this magazine was like revered. This was the magazine, that our whole entire group of little boys had. And I remember one time even he had left it on his bed, and he was worried his mom was going to make his bed while he was at school. She did. She set it on the head of his bed, never realized that it wasn't a Boy's Life magazine. But I mean, so yeah, there was a lot of work that had to go into that. Or I remember, I can't even tell you how many times I've talked to people, my age or older, that they knew where their dad's quote stash was, and they knew how to meticulously put it back so that the stack was exactly the same and that sort of thing. But so the Coolidge effect is fascinating. I think this is what we're running into now. It's this phenomenon where, it's seen in almost all animal species, where males exhibit this renewed sexual interest whenever a new female is introduced to have sex with, even after they're done, having sex with the prior. So the test was, there was a rat, and then I think that they brought a female rat in, and they mated. So then he didn't want to mate with her anymore. Then they bring a new female rat in. Well, he's going to go mate with her. And then he doesn't want to mate with the first two anymore. Then they bring in another female rat, and he's going to mate with her, and to the point of where he dies. I mean, it's, but it's like this type of mating system is where, what happens is the brain is designed to pour out this a tremendous amount of dopamine to then, hyper focus and basically get the girl. And if we go back to like evolutionary biology, our brain, and our brains were kind of thought that, okay, we're going to maybe do this one time. So when you see that willing female, just blast your dopamine, blast those neuroreceptors with dopamine. And so the problem is now, when you're exactly right? So now when a kid just is every day, he's getting on the computer and he's seeing, porn just at his fingertips, the brain continually thinks that that's another willing female. That's another willing female. That's another willing female. So it's just blasting the dopamine receptors, blasting them. And so then each time it does that, your brain's like not getting that same rush. And that's the stuff where I always say I get guys that are basically almost in zombie mode, where they're just clicking through video after video after video, just trying to see what's going to kind of stimulate them. And so what typically happens then is then they start looking at worse things or more, grotesque things, more violent things, more, because it's whatever they feel they need to get that dopamine rush, because they totally gamed the dopamine system. I mean, it just blasted those neural pathways. And so that, I think that exactly speaks to what you're talking about, that without having to kind of work for it, or, there it is. It's like it's there constantly. And that's the part that then just leads to kind of more and more aggressive or those kind of types of pornography. And when you're doing that with a kid 12, 13, 14 years old, you can see where that's going to set the table for some real challenges in both relationships, as well as in even a man's view on women growing up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I want to name this to normalize it, that I am seeing an increase in mindful, insightful men who don't have what we would call a problem, coming to the conclusion of, I'm going to look at less and less and less and less and less pornography because of this Coolidge effect.
Yes.
So if you are out there limiting it, like, please don't think that everyone is out there just looking at as much porn as possible. There are people who are mindful, who are really seeing like, okay, I mean, it's like anything. It's like chocolate. I cannot eat as much chocolate as I want to stuff into my face. I have to give myself some limits. And people are really coming to this on their own. And I just want to name that if you're doing that work alone, if you have had some of these ideas, please let these ideas solidify and know that you're not alone. And people are doing this all across the world to bring more mindfulness and more balance and more health into their own life and the life of their families.
Well, and I love that, because I feel like that in its essence is, whether it's my Path Back recovery program, or whether it's any kind of strength-based program, is saying that what we had talked about earlier. If somebody just feels like, okay, I am just done, never going to do this again. I mean, and for a small number of people, they never will, and that's wonderful for them. But for others, those triggers are kind of, those neural pathways are pretty deeply dug in, and so then that's the part where then, if they do then relapse, or again, whatever they want to call that now you can see where then they go to the, man, what's wrong with me story, and then they often just go right back to the behaviors they're at. So I like that you're saying that. I like that you're naming that. So it's just bringing some awareness. It's just not expecting perfection. It's taking the shame away, and it's just being more mindful of what your ultimate goal is. If it's to kind of lessen the use, or even after hearing that Coolidge effect description of just not letting things kind of continue to amp up, so to speak. But I love that you're saying that. It's like it can be done, and its perfection is not needed. It's not expected.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad we're talking about this today.
Me too.
Is there anything that you want to add about your program? Anything you think we need to know about porn, recovery, addiction?
So I think we've covered so much, because I'm not good at promoting myself. I literally I have a book that's been out for about a week, and it's called He's a Porn Addict Now What? An Expert and a Former Addict Answer Your Questions. It's available on Amazon. It debuted on the #1 spot in sexual health and recovery.
Wow! And it's congratulations!
I know, right? Oh, thank you, Nikki. I mean, it's like kind of cool. But what I love about it is I had a guy on my podcast named Joshua Shea, and he was a politician, ran a film festival, I think owned a magazine, and then he was caught with some chatting with teenage girls, so he ended up getting arrested. It was a big news story. He ended up doing some jail time, recovery, rehab, and he came out and he wrote a book called The Addiction That Nobody Knows. And then he did about 70 or 80 media spots, including my podcast. And I thought it went well. I enjoyed talking with him. But then he came back to me a few months later and pitched this project for his second book. And so we have 8 chapters of almost any question you can ask about pornography, about addiction, about compulsive sexual behavior. And I answer it from the view of the expert, and he answers it from the view of the addict. And we specifically went in with we're not going to see what the other person wrote in mind. And then it really, I feel like it's really powerful. I mean, mine is what you're getting here on your show, where I just go into strength-based, no shame, forgiveness. You can do this. And Josh it's fascinating to see him really dig deep into he's very open and honest about the stories his brain would constantly tell him, and the lies that he was telling himself, and the way he was covering things up, and the shame that he was facing. And so it's a fascinating book that just really talks about both sides of the equation. So I feel like for somebody who is experiencing betrayal trauma, it does help them understand maybe, or have a little bit more empathy for maybe the person that caused the betrayal, maybe the addict in their life. And I feel like for the person struggling with addiction, it does 2 things. One is I think that they'll read it and go, wow, that's me. Like, this is where I'm at. Not that means you're going to end up, getting arrested and being on TV, but maybe it feels like people can understand if they do feel like they're kind of starting to get a little bit more out of control. But I think it also helps the person that's struggling with maybe the addictive behavior to then see what their partner is really going through, and the self-doubt that their partner has, or when their partner is trying to say, man, is this about me, or am I not enough, or did I cause this? Which the answer to all of those is no, So I really feel like that the book really addresses from both sides of the coin. So I think it's good for trade, for addict, as well as for professionals who need a resource to kind of hand. So sorry to go on that big of a pitch, but
oh no, that's wonderful. And I'm happy that this fell 1 week after your release, because you're right. You're not good at promoting this, because I was just looking at your stuff and it's not even on your website.
Okay, fair point.
So I'm glad you got to mention it. So let me help you promote yourself again. Please tell me the name of the book one more time. Go ahead, plug it.
Yeah, so it's called He's a Porn Addict, Now What? An Expert and a Former Addict Answer Your Questions. And you can find it on Amazon. You can search for my name or just the name of the book itself. And it's available now. And I'm releasing a podcast the next day or two with an interview with Josh. We kind of talk about getting what the book led up to creating the book and kind of the whole process of writing the book. But I think it really can help. I think it can help a lot. And I'm really, I know I feel a little goofy saying it, but I am very proud of it and really excited it has a lot of professional reviews on the website itself. And so I think it'll be exciting to see if we can really help some people. So thank you, Nikki, for promoting it. That helps a lot.
You're so welcome. I can't wait to get it and put it on my shelf and dive into it.
I'm sending you. I'm sending you some. I'm sending you a couple of it. Perfect. Okay.
Thank you. I'll give you my address when we get off the call. That'll be great.
Perfect. Good.
Oh, thank you so much for doing this with me today. I know you were recovering from losing your voice. You sounded wonderful.
Thank you. I've been waiting for this for a long time. I know we were trying to get together, and both of us had maybe a missed or two, and I was so excited because your podcast on mine, again, if your listeners haven't heard you on my podcast, please go listen to that episode, because you were incredibly open, incredibly vulnerable. I think I've even forwarded you. I've texted you a couple of people that have shared things with me, right? Of what a difference that your episode on my show has made in helping people feel heard or feel okay or normal, or the whole HSP piece or equation has been mind blowing to me. I mean, it really has. Clients I was working with regularly that heard that and said, oh my gosh, I kind of get it now. And I mean, I don't think a day goes by where I'm not really, pulling up a HSP assessment or just help. And people just feel like they finally aren't, nothing's wrong with them, that they're human, that it can be a gift. And that was the thing you talked about it on my podcast being a superpower. And I remember about halfway through our interview when that really clicked, and I thought, doggone right, that is a superpower. And don't let anybody tell you it's not,
That's right. That's how I feel. Thank you so much for validating that for me and for helping me know it's still scary for me in sharing my story. So much of our training is in not sharing ourselves as a therapist. Right. And I think there's a lot that we can grow from when we vulnerably show who we really are and what we're really doing. I think that's the real human piece of this work that we do. And so thank you for validating that for me and supporting me.
Oh, absolutely. Can I share with you? I have to just one more thing, and this will actually make sense of what I'm about to share. I waited 150 episodes before I did a 2-part on my own ADHD diagnosis. And man, that again, talk about the floodgates opening up of people finally feeling like, wow, that's me too. And people that haven't wanted to talk about it, or people haven't wanted to admit it, and it's like, man, what a power to kind of just own it and embrace it. And so I hear you. I mean, I don't know why it took me so long to open up about it, but I mean, now if you go back and listen to this podcast, you probably see it oozing out of every pore. But it feels so good to just kind of own it.
It does. Really does. It does. Well, thank you for using your superpowers of sensitivity to help people in all the ways that you do. And thank you for coming on Emotional Badass and just coming into my world. I appreciate you so much. And I just know we're going to meet in real life
I love what you do.
Sometime soon. We're probably two of the busiest people on the planet, but it will happen.
It will. I can't wait. I can't wait. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for tuning in and listening to me interview Tony Overbay. If you'd like to learn more about his work, find him at tonyoverbay.com. Check out his new book that just released, He's a Porn Addict, Now What? And check out his podcast, The Virtual Couch. If you like his podcast, maybe you go back and listen to the episode where he interviews me. If you like this episode of Emotional Badass, please find the shows and share them with someone that will be interested and who can benefit from listening to this information. This is why I do Emotional Badass. I know it's why Tony does the virtual couch. We are here to reduce shame and help people live their very, very best lives. And it's not only possible, it's our jobs to help ourselves live our very, very best lives. Thank you so much. I'm an emotional badass. Tony Overbay is an emotional badass. You are an emotional badass. And together we are where Moxie meets mindful. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.